We have about victory and its discontents. It's a time period running from the 1940s to the 1950s. And in this period of time, there was a certain focus on the Red Scare. And because of this attention to the Red Scare, we have made a research question, which is, how has the Red Scare affected America? But before we go further into the question, we need to know what the Red Scare is.
The Red Scare is a scare for communism in the US. The Red Scare started right after the First World War, where the US feared and jailed innocent people if they expressed their opinion. Though in the early 1920s, the scare seemed to dissipate as quickly as it had begun. The Red Scare had its peak in the 1940s and throughout the 1950s during the Cold World War. If people expressed their views or showed any kind of signs that they were a socialist or a communist, people were jailed. This was done by the House of Un-American Activities Committee, where they investigated people in the search for communists and socialists. It was led by Joseph R. McCarthy.
Here we have drawn a timeline showing the most important events where the Red Scare had an impact on the US.
After the victory of the Second World War, the US didn't return into isolation as they did before. It was now the Soviet Union that was the enemy, and therefore the US founded the CIA, created military alliances, and produced even more weapons and bombs, notably the H-bomb, which should be far more powerful than the atomic bomb.
It was clear after the creation of the European Union that a new conflict was rising. It was also known as the Cold War. It was a conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, where both sides used educational and cultural programs to promote their values and views. The war itself was based on threats, and there wasn't actually any action taken.
The Soviet Union's point of view was pure communism, which led to a continuously Red Scare, since the Reds was referred as communist because the Soviet Union's color was red. And since it was a war where you had to prove whether your political points were correct or not, if you showed yourself as a communist or anything of the sort in the US, you were against the American principles and were siding with the enemy. The Red Scare had a huge influence during the Cold War, and it was mainly caused because there were threats coming from the Soviet Union. This was also around the time HUAC came in.
In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower was nominated for the presidency. From 1953 to 1961, he served as a president alongside Richard Nixon. He easily beat his Democratic rival, Adlai Stevenson, and set about to fulfill his campaign promises to both end the war and cut back on military spending. Both parties invited Eisenhower, or Ike as he was often referred to, but Eisenhower chose the Republicans, since the Democrats had entrenched in Washington since 1933, and he saw that the public wanted to change. Eisenhower was a very condescending figure and was a popular president. Even though his personality was much more canny prior to his presidency, Eisenhower was a lifelong military man, commanding the D-Day invasion while serving the Supreme Court commander in Europe during World War II.
Eisenhower also had to deal with the Red Scare and allegations made by the junior senator Joseph R. McCarthy that communists had secretly been working with the government in order to interfere with their opponents in order to obtain information on the counterparty. Critics accused the presidents of failing to deal with McCarthy's dissolute behavior, or McCarthyism as it was also called. However, when McCarthy centered his attack on the US Army, Eisenhower ordered the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. That led to a Senate censure that effectively ended McCarthy's career. When one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history began in 1952, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, a decision that declared the racial segregation in schools and was unconstitutional, Eisenhower was faced with the critics of the administration who pointed out that Eisenhower only reluctantly supported the court's decision to end segregation with all deliberate speed.
After the case Plessy versus Ferguson, the term separate but equal was introduced to American. It meant that even though the public facilities were separate for blacks and whites, they were still equal. That was the intention. It was clear to everyone that the whites had it better. Instead of requiring segregation, Kansas law gave cities with a population over 15,000 the right to segregate their school system. A Supreme Court decision from 1941 found that segregated junior high schools and high schools in Topeka, Kansas, were unequal, and that the segregation prevented the black students from learning. Therefore, they were integrated. 9 years later, Topeka elementary schools weren't integrated. That was when the Brown versus Board of Education Topeka began. Oliver Brown's daughter had to walk a mile to get to school every day, including crossing a railroad switchboard.
They lived about 7 blocks from an all-white school. There had already been 11 Supreme Court cases against segregation in Kansas. In order to file a 12th, plaintiffs were needed. One of them was Oliver Brown. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The court ruled in favor of Oliver Brown and the other plaintiffs. In doing so, it overruled Plessy versus Ferguson. It rejected the idea that equivalent but separate schools for African Americans and white students were constitutional. Chief Justice Thurgood Marshall summed up the court's decision, declaring, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." The court's rejection of separate but equal was a major victory for the civil rights movement. But how did the Red Scare affect America? When the Red Scare was happening, Americans became mildly hysterical because they were concerned about the communist forces who were testing nuclear bombs, and citizens began to prepare for what they thought might be a nuclear war. Politicians were influenced, and many people became distrusting of American politicians. Today, America remains a very liberal nation, though today they don't jail people who express their opinion, even if it might seem a bit different than their liberal point of view. Many of their decisions are still based off of their liberal point of view, and it's in their culture to let every man be themselves.